Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. Quick announcement. Next week's speaker is Will Wright. Most of you probably know of him. He's a, quote, legendary game designer. Among other things, he started off, well, not started off, but he did the whole sim genre. So he did SimCity and then SimAnt and The Sims. There's a new version of The Sims coming out soon, I understand. And then more recently, he's done something called Spore, which is not just creating people in a neighborhood, but creating life in the whole world. How many of you have played Spore or seen it? Okay, well, it's a cool program, and even cooler in terms of how he thinks of it in terms of the world of players doing it and stuff. So next week, Will Wright from a company he started called Maxis, which was bought out by Electronic Arts. So he's now officially Electronic Arts. This week we have Scott Snibbe, who has his own company which does arts, and he'll be telling you about a lot of what they do. I've known him for a number of years since we were both for a while at a place called Interval Research, and what I remember most strongly with sort of first becoming acquainted with his work is that he was working with haptics devices. He had a Phantom, which is one of these devices that moves around, and you could feel you were sort of moving weights and moving things in space, and there were these amazing visual representations of them flowing out on the screen. And it was this sort of blending of the programming, which took a lot of programming to make that work at all, and the sort of artistic sense of what you saw when you did it. And that's the kind of blending he's been doing in many projects for many years. And in particular, most recently, which I'll be telling you about, a lot of large-scale projects that go into museums. Some of you may have seen his work at the California Museum, or California Academy of Science, it's called, right, in San Francisco. But he's put it in other places. And it all has this same characteristic, which is it does interesting and sophisticated computing, but at the service of really expressive art. So I will let him show you more.
Great. Thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here, and going to do something. We have 90 minutes, is that right?
That's right.
Oh, great. Okay, so the bonus extended version. I'm pleased to be here, and we're doing something a little different today, which is I've been working in this medium of interactive projector camera systems for about 12 years now, and over that time came up with a number of different kind of tools and techniques, and also theories about the medium and what makes it different from other media, and how to make that medium particularly effective, how to really take advantage of it. So I have a small nonprofit called Sona Research, and we were lucky enough to get a grant from the National Science Foundation. And a big part of that grant was to produce this formalization, to actually take some time, look back at a decade of work, and formalize some of the principles of the medium through a few examples. And Hayes Raffel, who's here, was my co-author. At the time he was at MIT's Tangible Media Group, with Hiroshi Ishii. And he was really instrumental in bouncing these ideas off, putting them into one category, then another category, and also framing them within the context of the CHI community, the computer-human interface community. So, here's a little bit about the branding. So, who am I? I'm a person. I'm Scott Snibbe. I actually began doing this as an artist, kind of almost as a sideline when I was at Interval Research, and we were just getting to use computer vision and computer graphic systems, and I started having some experiments on my own that I was showing in art world context. And I still continue to do that, albeit at a small level, maybe make one new piece a year. The biggest activity for this last few years is Snibbe Interactive, which is a corporation I started to kind of commercialize and distribute these kind of experiences in a very robust way all over the world for museums, and now more and more for entertainment and also branding. And then finally, because I was kind of raised in research, I grew up, I was just talking to these guys that, when I was in school, the only way to do computer graphics and interface was to work in a research lab. In fact, the only way to have a color monitor was to work in a research lab. I'm embarrassed that I'm getting a little older. So I've always kind of framed development as a research process because I was raised that way, in college. And then also I worked at a research lab called Interval Research. And also at Adobe, I worked at Adobe Systems and Adobe Research. So it was gratifying to get to go back to that research context for this work, and even more so to get to present it to you today. So first of all, what is social immersive media? It's a series of things that I bet all of you are familiar with at this point. Augmented reality. I don't even think I need to explain that term for this audience, do I? It's a type of, no, I don't think so. Scott's shaking his head, so I trust Scott. Camera projector systems, you know what that is. Using the body as an unencumbered interface, nothing at all except your body is the interface. Now here's where it starts to become, more targeted, is to focus on social interaction. So how do you make experiences that focus on social interaction? In fact, where social interaction may even be as an equal component to interacting with the media or even dominant. Building on the language of cinema, I think many of my colleagues, both in the arts and in computer science and research, were big film fans. Many of them studied film and made films. In fact, I also studied film at the Rhode Island School of Design and made films. And I think it's very worthwhile to emphasize the value of looking to the language of cinema as we're doing anything time-based, because cinema is now more than 100 years old. It's a mature time-based medium. And there's an incredible amount of tools and techniques we can learn from the way people tell stories and structure space and time. And then, of course, why? I think this is always it's actually a question we often don't ask when we're doing research. We just say, we can do it, right? But now that, especially because my company's out there and trying to serve needs of people, I'm often thinking of this balance, not just it's cool, but also why does somebody need it? So why social immersive media? A lot of the reason why my company grew is that people had a number of things that were difficult to express using any other medium. So in science museums, and museums in particularly, something that a guy named Tom Rockwell, who is a vice president at the Exploratorium, said to me is that we've got a bunch of things that are too big, too small, too fast, too slow, invisible, and I also add boring. Things that, like, for example, networks. This is not an interesting topic for a 9-year-old. But there's a way to make it interesting if you can make it social, emotional, and physical. So, furthermore, the mainstays of museums and entertainment are now at home, right? So, you used to have these kiosks, these touchscreen computers you could interact with it in museums, and that was exciting, but now everyone has the internet. And of course, you also used to have a lot of movies that you go into a room and sit down and watch it in a museum. And again, everyone has those gigantic TVs at home. So how do you make something that's novel and can only be experienced in a public space? And this is still something like that, and may remain so because of its scale. Often it would be too big for an average person to have in their home. And of course, in public space, you have crowds and groups of people, not individuals. So why not make something that engages them together, rather than forcing them to take turns? And then there's also, we have some references in the paper if you want to look it up. Some of you might know. But there's also a lot of evidence that in many situations, social interaction enhances learning, engagement, and even people's happiness, of course. There's a lot of evidence of that being alone will make you go crazy. There was a great article in the New Yorker about that just a couple weeks ago, actually. And then to make it a little more poetic, there's a great quote from Confucius, who said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So by actually physically engaging and doing something, even Confucius understood, without any user studies, more intuitively, that you might have a better chance of understanding a phenomenon. So now, how do we systematize social immersive media? So we're trying to answer a number of questions. What's the language of social immersive media? I think many of you have been involved in projects where you have to break something down into what are the nouns, what are the verbs of this problem. This was probably the most unique aspect of this, is how do we control and modulate people's responses and behavior? This turned out to be, I think, the central area of interest with this new medium. And then how do we design experiences for the greatest educational and cultural impact? So there's a huge amount of related work many of you are familiar with. I'll just go through a few examples. In the interactive arts, a gentleman named Myron Kruger is the pioneer in this field who built his own frame buffers and so on. It was incredible that he did this work when he did. And then many other people, Dave Rokeby, Camille Utterbach, Daniel Razin, Raphael Lozana-Hemmer, many others using this type of technology in the arts. There's also what some people call embodied interaction, which are systems for huge amounts of people to interact, such as this Cinematrix system where you use paddles, an audience uses paddles to all at once play a game or do surveys, and many other specific examples. Again, you can look at the paper if you want all these references. Of course, tangible interfaces like the digital desk was the first one, Pierre Wellner, and the I/O bulb, another early example from the Tangible Media Group at MIT. Many different types of interactive games. One of the earliest examples was a guy named Bill Freeman, who did some early computer vision for computer games research. And of course, many more recent examples like the iToy and the Wii, and something recently coined called exertion interfaces that deliberately make you exert effort to use them. You're seeing that a lot with the Wii and the Wii. What's the new one called? The Wii Fit. Yeah. And then, of course, there's also interactive advertising. Reactrix was a company doing this, a company called Gesture Tech and others using this technology because it has a powerful ability to kind of stick in people's minds and have them use it for a long time. And then, of course, there's multi-touch. And multi-touch actually faces a lot of the same challenges as this medium because it's a unique new medium. And multi-touch, I think, can fall into two different camps. When multi-touch is done well, it's a social interaction where gestures and multiple points actually work together in the space to do something more than you could just do alone with a screen. But then when multi-touch often doesn't live up to its potential is when you just treat the interface like a set of discrete cursors, right? So you have 5 people around a table, but they're all just doing their own individual interaction. And we'd argue that you're really falling short of a big multi-user experience if you only give each person an individual experience. So this framework starts with a core philosophy. Then we talk a little bit about design principles. After that, what we call narrative models, which are ways of structuring time. And then a series of specific interaction design techniques. And then the exhibit content and the design. And I like to talk a little bit about philosophy. A lot of my motivation comes from a very broad kind of range of influences. And this quote is a really nice example. Edmund Husserl was the pioneer of a philosophy called phenomenology, and a guy named Maurice Merleau-Ponty elaborated greatly on those ideas. This quote, I think, sums up some of the ideas of phenomenology quite well. Our body applies itself to space like a hand to an instrument, and when we wish to move about, we do not move the body as we move an object. We transport it without instruments as if by magic, since it is ours and because through it we have direct access to space. So something that phenomenologists assert is that reality only exists as an interplay between our consciousness, the perceived world, and our bodies. So our bodies are a really important part of our actual perception and understanding of the world. And that we each have some type of a gut, visceral mode of perception that precedes the analytic or the symbolic or even the linguistic understanding of things. So it seems like language is a higher level and a more powerful means to affect the world, yet we can't affect our most prized possession, right, our bodies, using language. You can't, So this really struck me, and in this research and in the work I've done with media, trying to engage people at this phenomenological level. So the level where they first understand an experience with your body non-symbolically, and then only later understand it rationally and symbolically. And I had to give a lot of talks, that's me, I had to give a lot of talks to high school students. It started about 8 years ago, and I really enjoyed it, and I had to kind of not mention the word phenomenology and other things that would just get people bored. Maybe you guys got bored by that, I don't know. So I tried to think of where these ideas come from in a more down-to-earth way in my own life. And I recalled when I was a kid, actually, that when I was about 6, 7 years old, I used to sit and look at my hand. And it was, at that age, you've started to be able to say whatever you want, what you don't want, what you want. Anyone who has kids knows. But I would actually talk to my hand, and I would say, hand, move. And it doesn't move, right? Your hand doesn't move when you tell it to. And that really surprised me, to be honest, because it seemed like when you gain language, you gain more power over the world. But I couldn't control, again, the thing that was my most prized possession, my body, with language. And then there was also another experiment I used to do with my hand, where I would say, oh, there's my hand and there's my arm. And when I say, well, wait a minute. It's funny, we were just talking about this during lunch. But I'd say, well, where does the hand end and the arm begin? We all say, well, it's somewhere around here. But, you zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. And is there a hand cell and an arm cell, right next to each other? No, certainly not, right? So it may sound like a kind of an absurd thing to talk about, but it's quite a deep point, because if you can't define the boundaries of something, then does that thing even exist, right? What is the label that we apply to objects and phenomena? And Terry was talking about this, just before, in terms of how we categorize birds and other types of categories. And if you interrogate anything, you start to see it's fuzzy at the boundaries. You just can't find that sharp divide. And the deepest interrogation is to interrogate yourself, right? And to say, well, where do I end, and where does this room begin? And so, for example, physically, we've already exchanged ourselves with each other during this talk, right? I've breathed in parts of you guys. You've breathed in parts of me. It seems a little gross. Yeah, especially given current pandemic alerts. But it's true. It's true. Parts of me are like rubbing off onto this, and all the other people who've spoken here are part of this podium. Not in some metaphorical way, like literally, right? So, and of course that works with ideas in school. I think you especially understand that. It's easy to say that I'm here giving a talk by myself, but really it's, every single person I learned from. I didn't make up any of the words that I'm using today to give this lecture, nor the ideas. It's just recombining. So that's kind of the more intuitive understanding of phenomenology, if you don't want to go read a big philosophy book. So the design principles of social immersive media are here to essentially reward users' participation. And here are the key principles that we've come up with. Is that, first of all, the experiences should be visceral. So things should be experienced physically and emotionally before they're experienced symbolically and rationally. So this tends to rule out some of the GUI type of interfaces where you do need a kind of rational analysis of buttons and menus and so on. Things should be responsive, which is, I think, quite obvious to anybody who's done any kind of graphics or games, that the experience responds immediately, clearly, and predictably. And then that the experience should be continually variable. So nature, for example, is infinitely variable, right? We don't have kind of discrete moments even between sunrise and sunset. That nature is infinitely variable and changing. You never have the same experience sitting next to a river, even though you call it the same river. So how can you do that? How can you make an experience that's not based on discrete steps but continuous? And there's two main ways that we talk about. One is, of course, by using simulation, so that there's a continuously changing dynamic simulation that you're interacting with. And the second is by making something personalized. So there's some aspect of your movement, your body, your image that goes into the media. Next is this idea of being socially scalable, which is one of the most difficult principles. So that means that experiences should be designed to be shared with others, that there's a richer level of engagement with more people. So more simply, if an interactive experience can accommodate more than one person, then it needs to meaningfully respond to them. And if you want a counterexample, think of an interface, and I've seen lots of these, interfaces that use a distance sensor, where there's something on a screen that will respond as you come closer or further away to it. And that's great by yourself, but once you have two people there, you no longer understand whether and how it's responding to you, right? Because it's either not working or it's only responding to one person and not to you. And that's probably the most difficult thing to achieve, and it rules out a lot of ideas you may have as you're brainstorming for experiences within this medium. And then we argue that the experiences should be socially familiar, that they augment and reinforce existing co-located social behaviors, like having a conversation. Then finally, that the experiences should be socially balanced, that an experience is designed to equally emphasize an awareness of yourself and others and the media. And again, a counterexample might be some video games where you're so completely immersed in the game that you totally forget you have a body, much less that there's someone else sitting next to you. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the narrative models, and then we'll get into some specific examples. Narrative models are ways of structuring time within an interactive experience. So the first model that we talk about in this research is experiential. So this is an experience that's continuous, that's predictable, and that's infinitely variable, again, like nature. So, like sitting next to a pond, again, you know what you're going to get. There's not going to be a big surprise there, but it's always a little bit different. There's a reason you go back. The next, and also it's timeless. There's also in a way no sense of time advancing, that you're just continuously there in one experience that's variable, but fundamentally the same in some way. The next model that we talk about is performance, and that's where we have an experience that's improvised, personalized via the recording of your body and your gesture, often, but encourages this kind of performance. The third one is the episodic model, where there's something that's structured by episodes, and now there's a progressive narrative that's possible. And then finally, a model that's like a game, which is probably the one we're all most familiar with, where there's a goal-oriented competition or collaboration. Now, the key word here is simultaneous, because with most games, most computer games, you're still often taking turns. Even with the Wii, you may be using a Wii, but one person has their turn until they die, then the next person has their turn physically until they die. So we want to challenge people that if an experience is large and physical and social, to make it somehow simultaneous rather than turn taking. So now we'll go into some examples. Some of you may be familiar with this. This was the first piece I made in this medium called Boundary Functions, and I'll show you a video of it in a second. And this is an example of the experiential model. So an experience that's continuous, predictable, but infinitely variable, like nature. So the first installation of this was, was it 98 or earlier? Yeah, I think 1998. So this is a permanent installation of the piece in Germany. And you see, as people walk on this floor, lines are drawn that divide them from each other. So if there's two people, there's just one line between them. A third comes in and divides them. I bet a lot of people here could name this as a Voronoi diagram, right? But this diagram has a particular meaning when you draw it on top of people, which is that it shows you your personal space. So the space that's closer to you than to anybody else. And what I was trying to show with this piece is the same as with that example of your hand, that even though you have this thing you call personal space, it only exists when you're around other people, and it changes without your control. So to call it your own is really kind of a mistake, right? The other thing you'll see is that this experience tends to energize people's behavior. So by seeing a line on the ground, a majority of people seem to want to step on it, right? But because the piece has a line slip away before you can touch it, it tends to kind of excite you. The other thing to look at in this piece is that in a way it's kind of a radically social interactive piece, because when one person goes onto the floor, nothing happens, right? There's no interactive experience at all until a second person comes. Admittedly, it's a primitive kind of simple interaction with the line, but it has a very powerful impact on people because it relates so much to the way we relate to other people. So just to make this a little more concrete, there's a little table that shows these principles of social immersivity with respect to this piece boundary functions. So the piece is visceral because, and this is kind of obvious, right? But because it responds to people's whole bodies and the relationship between their bodies. It's responsive just by the way that it's programmed, right? That it's a 60 hertz refresh, and it responds, even if you just lean a little bit, the line leans. That's very important to give people this kind of subtle feedback. It's continuously variable in that the tiles change continuously, responding to everyone's unique location and posture and size. And it's socially scalable, that it's more visually and socially complex with more people. It's socially familiar because it takes this thing, personal space, that's normally invisible, but that we feel, and it makes it visible. And then finally, it's socially balanced because people interact with the projection as often as they do with each other. So it actually tends to enliven social interaction. I'll tell you something else interesting about this piece, which is that I saw different responses in people in different cultures. So, for example, the first time I installed this piece, it was in Austria, and people got onto the floor and they went to opposite sides of the floor, and just stood there. And I just thought, oh my God, it was a failure. It was at a big art show. It was like one of the first public times the very first time I ever presented one of these pieces. And when you're making an interactive experience, you give up tons of control because you don't quite know what people are going to do in it. So I essentially thought I had failed. It was better at the opening because people had to go onto the floor, right? There just wasn't enough room, so it made them interact. But when people were left to themselves, they would kind of go to the sides. So then the piece got popular and started getting invited to other countries, and then it went to Japan soon after. And in Japan, the response was the opposite. So people would immediately go, even strangers would come and touch each other and experiment with what the social relationships were in the piece. So I started to realize that this piece is a cultural psychological experiment, that it's showing us some of the different ways that people interact within the norms of their culture. So then I started trying to pay more attention as the piece went to different countries, and we installed it in New York, I think in 2002, and I was wondering, what's going to happen in New York. So we went to New York, and what happened was people get onto the floor and they just hold still. Not at the edges, but just wherever they found a spot. And I thought, what does this mean? What does this say about New York culture? I'm from New York originally. And then I thought, oh, I understand. It's just everything is so hard to get in New York, like your apartment, your job. People scan the obituaries, on Saturday night to look for apartments that are opening. So I thought, oh, that's just part of New York culture. A person just unconsciously has the sense that I've got this space and I'm not going to give it up. It's something I'd like to experiment more formally, though. Obviously, we haven't done a real cultural psychological experiment, so maybe in future research. So the next type of narrative model is called a performance narrative. And as an example, we'll use this early piece called Deep Walls. Again, a performance narrative is one that's improvised, personalized, often by using your body or gesture recording. So this piece, Deep Walls, is, at its simplest, it's a way of making a movie with your body. So whereas you might think, okay, naively you might think, oh, I'm going to make a photo booth kind of application that counts down, lets you make a movie with your body, and then plays it back. But I wanted to make something where you are really in control of that process. So the piece just invisibly starts recording as soon as you enter into the space, as soon as the first person enters into the space, and then it invisibly stops recording when the last. And then it shows that video on the screen. So there's a few interesting things we observed from Deep Walls. One of them, of course, is this way that it encouraged performance, that people who weren't performers or dancers started doing, crazy things, bobbing their heads around. You'd never see someone against a white wall at a party just starting to, do this. I mean, maybe late at night at certain parties. But, in general, people don't tend to do those things. And yet with this piece, people were completely encouraged to do that. So the piece had a way of disinhibiting people, making them more likely to behave kind of wildly and have fun. The second is this aspect of using the shadow, because I've seen applications that recorded people's live video and played it back. And what I observed, and I think maybe Scott knows more about this if there's any studies on this, but what I observed is that people were very uncomfortable seeing their own image played back. They start to get self-conscious about their skin, their hair, their clothes, and so on. But by using a shadow, we found that people were totally uninhibited, that none of us thinks our shadow is us, right? It's our shadow. And you don't have to think about all those things. It also preserves your privacy, which is very important in public experiences. So again, to analyze this a little more formally, with deep walls, your whole body is the interface. It's responsive, you understand that. By being continuously variable, I think you understand that we're creating a blank canvas to record any duration, any type of performance. So some people would use this piece for hours. I've seen kids and adults for 2 or 3 hours sometimes in front of this type of piece, which is extraordinary, right? It's socially scalable in that it can accommodate a group performance without any mode change. No one person's in control. I was just in Milwaukee and I saw a group of literally 35 people, and they all grouped together and run in, made a group performance, and then run out. So as many people can fit can use it. And in a lot of ways it does get better that way. It's socially familiar in that it echoes the culture of a dance floor, right, where kind of one person's performing and everyone else is watching. And then it's socially balanced because people alternate between an engaged performance and animated dialogue as viewers. So now to move on to an episodic narrative, the example that I want to use is this piece called 3 Drops. So again, the episodic narrative is structured by episodes, and there's some kind of progressive narrative possible. So this is one of the first ones we ever did. We got a little support from the National Science Foundation and worked with the Exploratorium. This was one we did multiple user studies on too, and learned a lot from that. So in this piece, we had a core message, which is that the forces of nature have different dominance at different scale. So we start with this kind of simple abstract shower, and people just spontaneously do this. They just start to kind of take a shower with their clothes on, which you would never see normally, right? And then the piece zooms in, and you have a single drop of water, and this shows you how surface tension dominates, right? So now you can't get wet. But notice how the experience is social, that you can hand this off to another person, and the experience becomes that much more interesting for it. And then finally, the piece zooms in, and you see molecules. So you see individual water molecules in different chains and loops, and as they are attracted to your shadow as if your shadow was an imperfection in the water, like a piece of dirt. And notice the change in behavior, how people now hold still and are really calm, which is something very difficult to do in a public interactive situation. But by rewarding stillness, you can encourage it. And what I didn't show here is that there's also some sound. So we actually did a user study, and since we have a little extra time, it's worth talking about. So the first version of this cut between episodes, and it was silent. And when we did a user study, we found that everybody loved it. Like all these pieces usually, that people enjoy the experience is usually like 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. But then you ask people, what's this about? And a number of people didn't understand that they were still looking at water. So we wanted to figure out, and that was essential for people to understand that this was the same phenomenon at different scales. So what we decided to do, how we solved that problem that we found through the study, is that we added zooming, just like in Powers of 10 and other kind of movies that you've seen, that really shows you that you're moving into the same phenomena. And we also added sound. So in the first episode now we have the sound of a shower. In the second we have a sound of dripping. And in the third one, which is the one where people got the most confused, we added the sound of water running, so like a stream. So obviously that's not the way molecules really sound, but it made people understand. It worked with the image, and it made people understand they were still looking at water. And then we did a subsequent study just to confirm that, and indeed that now people finally understood that this was water and the forces of nature different or have different dominance at different scale. So again, just to hit this home, I think you're starting to understand pretty clearly, but people are using their whole body as an interface, the responsiveness, the continuous variability is worth looking at again. Rather than using some kind of pre-recorded animations, each episode is a simulation, is a molecular simulation or some kind of physical simulation, so that it varies and it invites this continuous interaction with the user. And then it's socially scalable again because each episode responds to all the people in the frame and encourages a game in that second episode where people kind of play catch with the ball. And then of course it's familiar and echoing, taking a shower, playing catch, collecting things. And again, the socially balanced aspect is something we observed where people are, often turning to each other, laughing, talking about the experience, and then turning back. So now for the example of a game narrative, we'll show a piece called Fear. So again, we want to talk about how you make a game that has a simultaneous goal-oriented competition or collaboration. So this was done for a traveling exhibition that started at the California Science Center in Los Angeles. And the idea is to teach people about the freeze or flee instinct. So what we do is we create this kind of storybook environment with simulated shadows rather than real shadows and a jaguar that's pacing back and forth. So you're collecting fruit in this almost kind of biblical interface. And that tends to engage people right away. It's something obvious. And then from time to time, the jaguar stops and stares at you. And if you're standing still, your shadow appears in outline to show that the jaguar can't see you or isn't noticing you. But then if you start to move, your shadow starts to turn red as a warning. And if you don't stop, then you get attacked. There you go. So kids enjoy that. Kids really enjoy it. So that's fear. So again, to analyze it in light of these principles of social immersive media, I think in visceral, responsive, you understand the continuously variable by incorporating visitors' shadows, by using a simulated death rather than a pre-recorded sequence. So it's always, it uses their shadow and it's always collapses in a unique way. And then, a simulation for the fruit and so on. It's socially scalable. People can pass fruit to each other. People also would push each other to cause an attack, to make the jaguar attack the other guy. And then, familiar as this kind of storybook representation. There we go. So from these basic principles, I'm interested in trying to develop a design language for this medium. That was the whole purpose of writing this paper, is to have some principles that people can share. So the design language is comprised of interaction design techniques, some of the principles of character animation and cinema, as I mentioned, some considerations of how to construct environments when you create these experiences, so a little bit about the software, although not much, how to make multiple software representations. And then probably the most important part is designing for behavior. So how do we design these experiences to affect people's behavior? So starting with the interaction design techniques, one of our basic fundamental premises is that extending the graphical user interface model to social space is really a misguided approach at best. People who research direct manipulation for screen interfaces have also suggested the importance of continuous fine-grained feedback to our actions. So some of these design techniques here that we've identified are the following. The first is the choice of the narrative model. So if you want to create an open-ended experience, then you might want to choose the experiential model that has a timeless kind of experience, or the performance model where people keep getting encouraged to perform over and over again. If you want a more structured experience, you might choose the episodic or the game model. Now in talking about this continuous versus discrete argument, a good way to start this is by talking about the body and say, is the body a cursor, right? I'm sure many of you have heard this argument before, but when you're using a graphical user interface, your body gets collapsed to kind of one eye and the tip of one finger, right? You're just kind of one point for input and two-dimensional flat screen you're looking at. So of course human social and most importantly making discrete choices. So choosing a menu item, choosing this, pressing a button. So of course human social interaction is continuous, with continuously variable, continuous sound, continuous touch. And it's as I was mentioning before, it relates to this principle of direct manipulation that a lot of people have applied to graphical user interfaces. Another principle that we use is this idea of recording and replaying. So by recording a user and incorporating them into an experience, or their image or their movements into an experience, you create a personalized experience that grabs their attention, right? Especially for younger people, but really for everyone. When you make something about them or incorporate them, then they become more interested. Try sometime if you meet someone who's really, really busy, who says, I don't have any time at all for you, right? Just start asking them about themselves. And all of a sudden, they have a lot of time to talk, right? And then finally, I mentioned this before, but when we use shadow and silhouette, there's this interesting borderline between realism and privacy, where you have something that's personalized that I can recognize as me and my friends can, and yet it still keeps me anonymous and not worried about my appearance and so on. So some of the principles of character animation, which just don't really have enough time to go into in depth, but if you don't know about these things, I'd really encourage you to go look at, there's some papers written about, there's some early paper by John Lasseter, now there's whole books about it, and papers. Look at your iPhone or the Mac Apple interface, which uses tons of principles of animation, but many of you may not be aware of that. So there's some basic principles of animation. These were formalized by animators at Disney. One is easing in and out. You know that nothing abruptly starts to move and abruptly stops moving. That natural, the movements of human beings and other beings naturally kind of ease in and ease out. They start gradually and they end gradually. This principle of overlapping action is important, that if you have multiple things happening, that one doesn't usually end before the other one begins. For example, as you're going to open a door, you're reaching out to it, like your act of opening the door is completely integrated with reaching towards it. Right? Follow through, which is that actions don't end abruptly, but follow through. For example, with a golf swing, it doesn't end when you hit the ball, but it continues all the way through. Staging, which is a very important principle and will save you kind of time and money if you're aware of it, which is that people can only attend to one thing at once in their minds. So if you have like Bugs Bunny running like crazy over here and Elmer Fudd jumping up and down over here on the screen, you've wasted a ton of money and time by doing both of those things, because a person can only pay attention to one at once. So when you're designing interfaces in these immersive experiences, it's the same thing to think, where should people's attention be at any moment, and how do I kind of economize the way that I design the experience with that in mind. Squash and stretch, of course, is this principle that things deform as they move. They're not just rigid bodies moving in space, especially faces. And then exaggeration, because you usually have to simplify the representation in some kind of immersive experience or game experience, then you often need to exaggerate it. If Will Wright's coming next time, I bet he'll talk about that. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering whether you think any of these principles might be culturally defined. So in other words, based on the animation that we grew up seeing these kids, is it possible that a different culture would have exactly the opposite instinct for one of these ideas?
I suppose it's possible. I don't really know the answer, so I think that's kind of the most honest answer. The animators, it was trial and error, right? The animators who came up with this was through trying to make things that engaged an audience and also engaged themselves. So of course it all started, in Hollywood, but still a lot of the principles seem to work in China and India and Africa. But I don't have the answer to that. If there's a good book about it, let me know, because that's a great question. And then timing, of course. The amount of time that an action takes radically changes the way that you perceive it. So for example, the same action, like just moving your head left to right, if that happened in a 30th of a second, it's as if you heard a gunshot or something. But if it happened over half a second, it's as if you're feeling pensive, you're stretching your neck. So timing changes our emotional perception or our analytical perception. And then here's the last thing, which I didn't mention before. But in terms of cinema, we found that we almost always try to avoid a cut in our experiences based on what we learned from 3 drops. I didn't mention the second thing we learned, which was that as soon as the experience cut from one scene to another, that's when most people left. Right? As soon as something changes, that's when they leave. So if you want to make something continuously engage people, then you want to avoid that cut. On the other hand, if you do want people to leave, then if you add a cut, a very distinct end to something, then you can make them leave. So creating environments that invite interaction, some of this is kind of obvious, but put your piece in an area where there's natural human traffic. You need significant extra offstage space. People need to come in, be able to move freely in and out of an experience. A space that's not too dark. It's important that people see each other, not just the media. And of course, have the equipment out of reach. This is actually the most common mistake of the kind of introductory media creator, is whatever you make gets destroyed by your audience. Handicapped accessibility is kind of ethically important, and also the law when you do something in space. Have multiple software representations. So this is just a little bit about the software, which probably of a lot of interest to a lot of you, but I'll only speak a little bit about here. We only speak a little bit about in the paper. So software representations are the model of the user's body and his or her gestures and the graphical response, right? So a lot of the way we program things is very much inspired by real-time systems and by non-photorealistic animation. And the insight that we had from those 2 domains is that certain problems are easy in one domain and difficult in another domain. So for example, collision detection is a great example, where you might have a raster bitmap representation of a camera image, and then you may have a vector representation of the shapes that were in that. You may have discrete representations of this individuals in this space, and then you could have a continuous representation of that person's movements, and then 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensional models of the space, time, and their body. And there's also abstractions, so you can generalize at a higher level and know where someone's hand is, where their head is, if they're moving fast or slow, if their shapes are concave or convex. And so I'd say one of the principal techniques we use is that we often change representations on the fly. And this is totally inspired by cinema. Like the very first animation pioneers realized that you can do anything between 2 frames of film, right? So in the early pioneers of animation, they'd be using live action, and then at a certain point, they would just switch to an animated representation, switch to a drawn representation or a 3D animation. Clay, 3D, or objects. And that's what we realized. There's kind of infinite amount of space between the frames to do whatever you want. So like in Fear, when the jaguar attacks your body changes representation all of a sudden to become a simulation, a spring and mesh type of simulation. So it's good to keep in mind. I think a lot of us don't remain aware of that. We kind of project the way our world works into the world of the computer, and we try to make a representation that kind of works in every case or is, quote, realistic. But you have the freedom, when you're making a dynamic, interactive experience, to change the representation at any moment. And as long as it looks the same for the next frame, then you have that continuity. So then finally, into designing for social behavior, I think this is probably the biggest insight, is that you can change people's behavior by the way that you design these experiences. So for example, if you make interactive elements that slip away, like in boundary functions, you create an energizing space, a space where people get kind of more and more excited. You can create a calming experience by rewarding stillness, like at the last episode of 3 Drops. You can create a competition by having some kind of finite resource or a penalty or a side-by-side comparison. This is probably what we're all most familiar with from video games. And then you can make people perform. You can actually make people perform by incorporating a representation of the user, but not coming too close to their actual representation, or they might run away in fear or sue you. You can disinhibit people by rewarding gross movements and making funny faces and so on. And we also believe that you can encourage learning. This is a little bit more of a stretch because it's more difficult to measure. But there's this idea from Vygotsky of a pivot. Like there's an object that helps you take an abstract concept and internalize it in your own mind via, an embodied representation. And, we think we have several examples of this, but can only measure it in kind of a crude way through these user studies. So, for example, the idea of personal space and boundary functions, comes to you through that experience. The idea of how recordings are made in cinema, the nanoscale, the Freezer-Flee response, etc. So the key here is to be aware. And the last one is that with dwell time, that you can precisely control dwell time by limiting it with a cut or by making an avatar disappear. At the end of fear, your shadow disappears, so you don't get any more response. And you can increase dwell time by by making an experience continuously variable, so constantly, so moment to moment, the experience is taking you along and drawing you in, by personalizing the media or by having some competition. So the key take-home is that be aware that when you're creating this social immersive media, you're always designing for social behavior, whether you like it or not. So it's nice to have some formalization for it and to really think about how to do it. Something we've hinted at throughout the paper is the difficulty of evaluation with these experiences. So one of the challenges the multiple domains value systems. So in human-computer interaction, it's often usability or psychology, social psychology. In art, the evaluation is about meaning, about culture, often about mystery, that something's not fully explained, actually, which is an important part of art. It might help you help explain to you why art is so unexplainable sometimes. And then in museums, of course, learning and dwell time are key measures. In entertainment, it's having fun and attendance. And then in advertising is the impressions and your ability to recall the experience. So all of these use their own techniques for evaluating experiences, and there's often very little crossover. There's some things you can measure mechanically, such as dwell time. You can do that automatically even with the same camera, same system. Some things you can measure via survey, like getting the key ideas in the piece, people's emotional level of engagement. But then the things that are difficult to measure are a lot of the ones that I care about the most, and I think that we all might care about the most, which is how these experiences might impact your worldview, your values, your social relationships, or even your career choice. When we're making experiences in science museums, we're often trying to encourage people to go into the sciences, especially some of the people that are more on the social end of the scale that would be discouraged from going into the sciences because of their gender, because of the way they interact with people, and so on. So now I think so that's most of our research. Those are actually earlier pieces that we generalized into this framework. What we've been trying to do over now the last 8 more years is moving towards experiences that are like interactive cinema. So they're experiences that have the same level of emotional engagement that a movie has, but one where you still remain of your body and your relationship to other people. And I want to use the remainder of the talk to just show some examples of that, since this is a little bit longer talk, and look at how those principles from some of the more basic pieces inform more complicated pieces with higher production values. Okay. So let's go into some of those. Let's see here. Okay. Oops. So has anybody here been to the California Academy of Sciences? yet? Oh, great. So some of you have seen some of these pieces. So this is a piece we made called Arctic Ice, which is a piece to, again, this is one of those kind of boring, complicated topics of feedback loops in the Arctic, where the more ice there is in the Arctic, the more sunlight is reflected and the colder it gets, whereas the less ice there is, the more the dark ocean absorbs light and the hotter it gets, and there's a feedback loop there. So difficult, somewhat boring, and slow process to explain to kids and people in general. So what we did is we tried to make this emotional by having a little baby polar bear and a mama polar bear. And you have to unite them by making the Arctic cold enough for the ice floes to get big enough that they can jump to each other. So your body, within the shadow of your body, you see little chunks of ice that reflect more of the sun's rays. And you need to work with multiple people in order to get that temperature down low enough, which is measured by the thermometer on the right. And then the little baby can jump and meet mom. So again, now this is moving a little more towards that cinematic direction where you're trying to make an experience that's, very, very emotional. This is another piece we made there called the Bug Rug. Again, kind of a difficult, there were a lot of masters in this piece. The scientists there wanted us to teach how scientists collect bugs in the wild and do that realistically, but still make it engaging to kids and make them learn about the types of bugs in the forest. So we made a piece where you can never kill anything in most of our pieces, well, except yourself, I guess, in fear. But in this piece, if you hold still, you can drop bait. And then if you get it into these traps, then the bugs are drawn there. And then when you see one of those bugs, then the bug comes up on a big screen, giant hissing cockroach. Yeah. So this kind of treads that fine line of being fun and yet still educational and satisfying the requirements of, hardcore scientists working there, that the piece was related to the way they actually work. This is a piece we did for the Beijing Olympics called Our Environment. So our task here, this was Johnson & Johnson hired us to do this piece, and we made an interactive floor projection that's trying to promote something abstract, like that Johnson & Johnson cares for the environment and is doing something about it, and to promote those kind of values in people. So what we made is a floor and an environment with projections onto the walls. On the wall projections are various quotes about the environment. There we go. And then when you walk on the floor, the floor presents this kind of field of grass. And if you walk rapidly across the floor, you actually just you destroy whatever's there. It reveals dirt, kind of like what would happen, in a real garden. But if you walk slowly, then flowers start to grow around you. And when you're close to other people, then those flowers expand into the other people. So it's kind of like 3 drops. It rewards moving slowly and carefully and working with others. So there you see the dirt path. Yeah. And then another piece, this is a piece from London Science Museum called Social Light, which is again a piece kind of on the boundary between art and science. They wanted us to do something that was inspired by light and electromagnetism, but was really something kind of magical and artistic. So we made this piece that has 3 episodes, so it's an episodic narrative. And as your body behaves differently. So in each episode, in one episode your body behaves like glass, in another like a prism, in another like a mirror. And so you really see the social interaction here. That's a great shot, right? It really shows you how people can use this together and how the experience can be even more engaging with more than one person. In this piece, 2 different people actually have 2 different behaviors. So one person on the right is a mirror, and the other person is this like magical absorbing substance, and their shadow becomes colored by those rays. So it's something we're doing more and more in pieces where different people have a different role in a piece. And then we also have this technology that connects to the internet. It's like another way of personalizing your experience where everything that gets done in the experience gets recorded as a video. and then you can email that to yourself and then upload it into Facebook or YouTube, MySpace, so the video becomes part of your personal identity. But again, it's anonymous, so that you and your friends can see that it's you, but to other people it's still anonymous and legal. Right. Compilation DVD. Now I want to show you a couple of things. There's a couple of different pieces from the fine art side that are worth showing, because they actually point more towards this narrative mode. So this is a piece called Chien. Has anyone ever seen this film in Chien Andalou by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel? It's the first one person. It's the first surrealist film, and so I made this piece, which is really an art piece that's inspired by that film, and all it consists of is this guy pulling a piano. And there's you can't immediately figure out how you're interacting with him. If you touch the piano, then it will kind of add a little more strain to the way he pulls. But eventually, if you touch him, then he starts to dissolve, and his body kind of is decomposing, and ants are coming out of it. So again, this is using the medium more in a poetic way, where it kind of connects. I actually thought this piece would need more explanation, but somehow this is an archetypal kind of image that a man pulling a piano kind of sums up a lot about how our existence is. Right? I think it's the biggest object a person can kind of carry by themselves. And then there's another recent piece too. Some of you may have seen this at the Berkeley Art Museum, but this is a slightly more complicated narrative piece called Falling Girl. It was shown relatively small at the Berkeley Art Museum on this projection screen, but meant to be very, very large. And this is mostly a story that you watch, and in which the visitors are just kind of bit players. So it begins with a woman on the top of a skyscraper, kind of going back and forth, which obviously sets up the kind of tension for the viewer. And then she jumps off, but she doesn't jump up. It doesn't look like she has any intent of killing herself as she jumps off. It's more like a kind of headlong rush into life. So she performs this kind of dance, floating dance, as she falls slowly. And she encounters various people on the way down. So she encounters a party, and they're kind of flirting with her. And then in the next episode, this is where users appear. So there's these windows in which the participants themselves appear from time to time. But again, only as bit players for kind of a couple of 30-second interstitials within the whole piece. And then, then there's more kind of episodes that she encounters meeting some office workers. And then night starts to fall. And she looks down. About halfway down, she kind of realizes that where this is all headed. And again, you've got people interacting with it. So it may seem incongruous, but I was interested in trying to juxtapose, the viewers with this story and kind of see what would happen as an experiment in kind of lighter interactivity, where people are not the major actors, but minor actors in an experience. So then gradually what happens is that as dawn comes, she's become an old woman, and she falls by. This is actually inspired by a surrealist story by Dino Buzzati. So the piece is really a metaphor for the course of our lives, right? Kind of the shortness and preciousness of our lives. And we kind of all know where this is going. So kind of Hitchcock moment. But we actually did a study, was as part of this grant and we did kind of an A/B test where we made the piece interactive and non-interactive. And the preliminary results actually show that there was a stronger emotional engagement with the story, that people felt kind of more emotionally engaged and had a higher kind of range of emotions when the piece was interactive versus when it was not. Again, it's just a preliminary finding, but part of what we believe about interactivity and what some other people are finding. Okay, let's go with the quick time. Which falling girl? No. So I'll show you a few other things that we're working on, and I also want to leave a little bit of time for questions. This is actually another platform that we've been doing. This is a different type of technology where you use a stereo camera instead of a regular camera, because the physical setups for these pieces are a problem for a lot of people, because you need a special screen and so on. So this kind of experience, this is one where we have a body that mirrors what you do, and you can kind of change the different physical system. And you can imagine that as a character too. But this is, again, to get you kind of interested, instead of just looking at pictures of bodies or bodies. For a lot of the audience, making that interactive and connected to their own body gets them more engaged with it. Similarly, a lot of stuff we do is about the body, about movement. People, it's kind of our specialty, and a lot of people come to us. This is a piece that we finished and that's premiering in July at the Museum of Science and Industry called Get in the Action. And it's a piece where there's a coach who's teaching you something, in this case Tai Chi, and then there are these effects on your body that make you actually want to do it. One of the big problems we're having in this country is this obesity epidemic, childhood obesity. So to make experiences like exertion interfaces that make you really want to move and interact and learn something. So by giving you these trails of your body, you make something visible that isn't visible, which is kind of the beautiful poetry of all of our movements, if you could see the continuity of it. And this piece goes from episode to episode. This is there's a hip-hop dancer with kind of a different type of effect. But it's amazing what just adding this effect around your body does to your... That's me. I was getting really excited. It's really amazing. I can't believe how much I like this, actually, because I get a little jaded after 12 years. But I just loved it so much. It's really... You have to try it to understand how incredibly engaging it is. And I really learned, that you really learned that... I'm a terrible dancer, but I actually learned a couple of these moves. Same thing with basketball. You got a basketball player that teaches you. And then again, looking into the higher production value experiences, this is one called Looking for Life that premiered at the Nemo Science Center in Holland. So this is a piece about this, I don't know if any of you know of this experiment, I think it's a Yuri Miller experiment, where they run electricity through this vat of chemicals that resembles the oceans billions of years ago, and then these amino acids formed the building blocks of life. So again, for 9-year-olds, for 12-year-olds, how do you get them interested in this? Even for regular people. So we made a piece where you walk into the space and then you start getting hit by lightning, and then around your body start to form these protocellular walls, like lipid pairs. And then once they're fully formed, when you touch another person, this protocell can emerge from you. Yeah, here it is. So you touch another person and this protocell emerges. And people can interact with that. That's highly interactive, and you can see the little amino acids inside. And then gradually it drifts upward, and these quotes come in about the origins of life, mostly from scientists. And then they twist around like DNA. They still don't understand how self-replicating life emerged. So there's this kind of magical moment, and then the cells form more like amoebas. So they become kind of living creatures that move themselves off screen. I guess this is a good transition to Will Wright next time, right? So you see you've got a piece here that promotes a kind of dialogue and discovery about the origins of life. You could even see a piece like this in a creationism museum, right? And people kind of debating, where did things really come from? I think I'll just show one more and then we'll have some time for questions. This is another experience we did for Sony at their headquarters in New York. Inspired by kind of boundary functions, and that kind of experience is another social experience where you choose a color by walking across the outside of a floor, and you choose whatever color is there on the rim, and then as you touch other people, you exchange a little bit of yourself with them. So here we go. So when two people touch, there we go. If you get really close, they merge. And if you just touch, then you take a little bit of that person onto you. So you start to collect like a charm ring of all the people that you interact with. So, very much encouraging social interaction and making some kind of a commentary on it. So, a lot of, especially like bigger corporations, are very interested in promoting kind of a more kind of abstract, positive view of themselves. Like in this case, it's about your identity, your digital identity, relating to Sony, but very open to some kind of magical social experience to promote that in a very general way. So I think there's plenty more I could show, but why don't I leave another 15 minutes so we can have a little bit of discussion and questions. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
When you were showing the bug rug video, it looked like there was one kid who almost stomped on another kid's hand. I wonder if there are any funny stories about mishaps with these.
We do have insurance, but no one's ever.
Any funny unintended
Not that I know of. I mean, it's mostly not so. I mean, it's like the performing with the thing that really gets me is with the deep walls, because normal people will just start like shaking their heads and going completely crazy. I think that's probably the strongest example of like radically changing people's behavior. Seeing people normally, even at the big benefits, with people in tuxedos with their martinis just starting to go completely wild. I think that's been one of the most exciting things for me. But no injuries that I know of. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the kind of design principles that you talked about were very visual in their nature, and I was wondering if you thought a lot of them apply in analogous ways to sound, or if sound is a very different medium that has kind of its own property.
Well, I would say I'm not really an expert on sound. The thing I've noticed about sound, because I was trained in film, is that, and we do use sound in a lot of these pieces, but I left it off for this presentation, is that it cues your emotions so strongly and powerfully. So if you want an experience that's open-ended, I often found it was better to leave out the sound completely. And by open-ended, I also mean open-ended emotionally, that one person might interpret it one way, one person might interpret it another. But it also massively enhances interaction, though, when you touch something, if there's a sound, obviously, because our brains are trained to find these correlations. It makes the experience much more powerful. But I'm not an expert in. You guys are asking the questions I'm not an expert in to start with. I'm not an expert in audio interfaces, and I'm not sure how it would apply there. So it's a brand new area, really, like now that you have that iPod with sound. I think I know a couple of my friends now have gotten jobs as like audio interface person, but I don't know much about it myself. Yeah, other questions? Yeah.
Please talk about your process in collaborating with other people. How are the roles divided? Are you the artist and is the engineer someone else, or is it more?
Yeah, sure. So I started up till like 2002. I was doing everything. I was just, because this started small. I worked at Adobe. I worked on After Effects at Adobe. I worked on that team early on in my career. Worked at this research lab. Then I had a startup. Then that failed around 2001, like everything. And then I went into this as a smaller operation. It was just kind of my studio. I was working by myself, and I did everything end to end. And it got tiring. I literally installed like 50 or 100 pieces myself, and the demand went up. And then I realized, I've got to scale. So first it grew very gradually. First I had, a video assistant for 1 day, then 2 days, then an administrative assistant. Then I hired my first programmer. That was like the really big shift. And now I don't do any programming myself. It's gone all, I'm more like, I'm running the business, so that's a lot of my role now is more like structural, hiring people. I have like a creative director doing a lot of the creative work. But still, it's really, I'm involved right at the beginning, talking to people about the concept and conceptualizing it. And I'm involved at the key points for evaluating it, especially. It's that last 5%, I'm sure you've heard this a lot, but especially with art or media, it's literally like crap until the last 5%, and it can freak everyone out, especially if you have a client, who wants to see intermediate results, because you guys know as programmers, like 90% of the work's totally invisible, and then all of a sudden you have like one thing on the screen at 92%, and then your thing's due in a couple days, but it's that last like 5% that brings it together. But to do it really well, you've got to do that right last 5%. You really it's just like film, if you're in special effects and animation. And these are the principles that I'm often, that's why I wrote this paper. These are the things that I'm often addressing, besides just pure quality, if there's some kind of issue of quality. It's these issues that are talking about at the end that the people I'm working with aren't always aware of. So I'm like, okay, you've got to put your mind into the mind of a person, a stranger coming into this. And I know a lot of the ways people often do that is by actually having strangers come and observe it. But that's time-consuming and in a way unnecessary. If you have empathy, you can do it yourself. You can think, what is the person going to do in this? Let's think through a naive person's view of this experience. So that's my involvement at this point. And I don't even go install them usually at somebody else. So it's just like right at the beginning and the key points evaluating it. Certainly at the design, when we design the storyboards and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, so in the first half of your talk, you described this design framework, which seemed to me was developed by reflecting on all of these really compelling examples you've done. And so I'm curious to what degree it's kind of a descriptive framework versus to what degree you've put it into practice and kind of what lessons you've learned and basically trying to take this route of reflection and then how does that translate back into design process?
Well, what I've found is that I've been giving this talk kind of informally to my employees, for years, and I found that they really took it to heart. I mean, they were so excited when I started kind of formalizing and presenting these things as principles. Because you're right, from my own perspective, it grew bottom up, just from specific examples and my own experience, and also the opportunity to give talks, because I give, like 20 to 50 talks a year or something, so have to talk about something, so that these kind of things. So yeah, I found the differences between me and everybody else, right? Because for me it grew up organically, but then I found giving people top down has really worked well. And now that I've published it, it'll be interesting to see if other people find value in it. I mean, that's really an experiment. And it's also there for critique and argument to say, oh, this part's wrong or this should be elaborated. And I'd love a chance to be part of that too. There's a lot more than what I've written about here, especially in terms of narrative experiences and more sophisticated ways of structuring time. So hopefully we'll get an opportunity to do that either through another grant or some other opportunity. But that's a great question. Yeah, Terry, you have a question?
One of the things that I'm fascinated by in examples is the shadow business, the idea that you have identity and that you have this direct visual connection to it, but it's not you. I was curious if you think about non-immersive social media, so think about web and all those kinds of things. I mean, anonymous avatars sort of have that quality.
Yeah.
Do you have a feel for how it translates into other environments?
Well, it's like you're saying, it's usually you're completely, you kind of go all the way in most kind of online experiences where there's no trust. You don't know whether it's you or not. I mean, it's quite unique. That's part of why we started making this online sharing technology, because it's a way to take that experience and bring it online so that your identity starts to come in personalized. But I actually, my dream, I have an idea of something called generous media, which is like a bigger idea about media than just this. This is very specifically towards this medium. But I'm really interested in trying to formalize a little bit, well, maybe what you're talking about, which is media that are kind of personalizable and open-ended in some way. Maybe you guys know of some references already you can point me to. But it's this idea I got from someone who once said to me, oh, your work is very generous. And I thought, that's an interesting thing to say. And then I thought, yeah, this is a really interesting idea for a framework, is types of media that are generous. So I'm really interested in trying to develop that idea further, and maybe it will go towards answering your question. There are some online experiences like that I would call kind of generous. It's not exactly answering your question, but you know, the Electric Sheep, like Scott Draves made this kind of screensaver that is genetically evolving, and you choose, they're abstract animations that kind of infinitely loop and evolve into each other. But people are also choosing the ones that they like, and the people who get more involved can write the code. It's open source. They can author movies themselves. So these kind of experiences where it's open-ended, it's continuously variable, it's personalizable, it's social, but it doesn't, you know, that example has all these qualities, but it's not physical, it's not visceral. So I'm really interested in coming up with a framework much more broad, because I think these kind of experiences, they are generous. They do, in a way, they nourish our social relationships and like positive feelings and experiences in people. And not all media does that, right? So that's part of why part of my kind of dreams for my own career is to encourage those things more. So I'd like to find the answer. I don't have an answer to what you're saying, but I'm glad you brought it up, because it's something I'm trying to figure out. Yeah?
Some of your design principles might change out of public space. You're in home, communicating with
Yeah, so it just depends to the extent. When people can encounter something every day, I think that's probably one of the fundamental changes. And some of the pieces like Deep Walls that records your shadow, when we've installed those pieces in museums, it's often a favorite of the staff there, the guards and the staff and the people that work there. And I think that hints a little bit at what these kind of experiences might be as part of your everyday life, is that if you have this experience that's open-ended and physical and integrated into your life, you may be, it becomes kind of a continuously variable part of your life. I have someone who just bought one for their house. There's the first person who ever bought one of these things for their house. So I'm really curious how she's going to experience it. You know, she's put like a recording surface near her entryway and then a playback surface in her living room. So like during parties, people can kind of send messages to the people in the other room, you know, if they're making out or arguing or whatever. And then in the other room, people kind of voyeuristically see what's going on. So I'm interested in seeing, these are some of my hypotheses about what's going to happen, that this type of technology might become a part of like domestic communication or, you know, private social circles communication. Those are just some guesses, but yeah.
I'm wondering if, like, what your experience has been in terms of the different interactions that kids do versus adults, or is there some sort of magical quality about your pieces that bring people, like, all to the same level?
No, that's a great question. It's very different. And again, it was one of my goals, is to make pieces that are engaging for a 2-year-old, yet also engaging for a PhD in art history, computer science, whatever. And the way is by this visceral engagement, right? Because that's the common denominator, right? But adults are obviously much more inhibited. So of course you'll see the kids running around, going crazy, having a ball, and they're never going to say, what an interesting commentary on personal space, right? Or phenomenology. Whereas the PhD, you probably never see running around having a ball, the art historian. But they'll say, oh, it's so fascinating, what a commentary on personal space. So again, that's part of my own goals, is to make experiences that work across all of those levels. And again, I think borrowing from nature, I know it's weird, it may seem a little weird talking about these pieces as a natural analogy, because they're nothing but artificial, right, if you look. But we're using nature as an inspiration. because, in general, all the ages like going to the beach and so on. And I think you should really think about that. What is it about that experience that engages people? Like, go beyond the obvious and look at the qualities of interaction. Like, that's what I was trying to do. So look at the qualities of interaction at a pond or at watching a sunset and so on.
I think you missed a real opportunity for your Austrians that didn't respond. Think of them as the children. This talk out here, or some of the things that Terry said. It came to me when you finally had your virtual animal, at least. Why not in that scenario, for instance, put in a virtual person? But you, Wizard of Oz, that controls you on the back, whatever you want. But it's the ultimate social experiment. Could you have done something to somehow animate those Austrians to come out of their closets and whatever? But you get the idea. So virtual humans, for instance, in that context was one thing to explore. That
Oh, yeah.
you put the PhD behind, whatever, or somebody of different culture, see if they can somehow get them out of their closet.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. And I exaggerate that situation a little bit, but I think you're.
You missed an opportunity.
Yeah, that's exactly the direction. I've been working on a piece for a long time that's still not done, about Mary Baker Eddy, who is the founder of Christian Science, and it's almost done. And it uses more synthetic bodies in its interface. Like, characters will come out of your body, but then your body will be an important part of catalyzing the story forward. But the main problem is just the expense of. It kind of exponentially increases in expense of doing much more sophisticated interaction techniques. So hopefully that one will be done soon. But that's exactly the direction I'm interested in going, is having synthetic characters that where there's still a meaningful presence for your body.
You might be able to take advantage of some of the medical imaging technologies or whatever.
Sure.
Yes, right now it's expensive, but it'll come down in price. You can do something more creative with it. Let's put it this way.
Sure. There's also, if you look at computer vision research, like Chris Bregler at NYU, he can tell people's gender, maybe even people's racial or national identity based on the way they move. He's creating kind of motion signatures. So there's a lot you could use there. Any other? What's time? Oh yeah, we're at 2:00.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.